Right now, the negotiations for climate change are in a very interesting position in that the U.S. is clearly the key player. But it's not the U.S. administration, it really is the U.S. Congress. The administration is in a difficult negotiating position because they cannot move forward and commit to anything as they did in Kyoto without having Congress's support. So they're going to the table, likely without climate change legislation, and will be trying to help whatever they can to facilitate a conversation without necessarily committing the U.S. The other key players are going to be China, the other largest emitter of carbon in the world, with India, Brazil, the European Union also playing important parts. The Africa bloc, which walked out of discussions earlier this month in Barcelona, is not going to be a significant player in terms of reaching the necessary carbon targets, but they are an important player because they are representing a vocal part of the G77. And these are the countries that feel they have not contributed significantly to current greenhouse gas emissions and will need to have some assistance in dealing with climate change as it goes forward on the adaptation side. I like to think there are 4 essential elements to reducing carbon emissions overall for any kind of a global deal. And these are very controversial discussions, as we're having between countries, mostly because it's coming up with a global deal on climate change is in essence committing countries to a different type of economic growth than they've had before. So the 4 key elements that I look at are, first, I think every country has to be part of a global deal. You can't have just the industrialized countries committing to carbon caps. You need to also find ways for the developing countries to participate. That means the countries like China, which are now producing the largest amount of emissions in the world, also have to be part of that discussion. The second element, I would say, is that you have to find a way to really use the markets to help us pay for this. If you take advantage of the market system, right now cap and trade seems to be the most likely option. But you will also have other ways that we can utilize markets to encourage innovation. We think that about 86% of the new technology developed is going to have to come from the private sector. So to develop and disseminate that technology means that we have to come up with ways for the private sector in every country around the world to be motivated to develop that and get it out. Another key element here is going to be that we have to find a way to help fund adaptation over time. This has been a key requirement by the developing countries. They're saying they're going to be hit very hard, and especially small countries in Asia and Africa dealing with flooding, rising sea levels, desertification, extreme storms. And they don't have the ability right now to do that. So that's going to require new technology, but it's also going to require help and support and development assistance, education, kind of other key development factors as we look forward. The real issue is just focusing on the long term, that we need to have some short-term targets, but we also have to recognize that climate change is requiring a fundamental change in how we look at our economic growth. You need to develop a new model of sustainable economic growth. And what that means is that we can't expect it to happen immediately. We're going to have to utilize the market forces, we're going to have caps, but we're really going to have to understand that short to medium term targets of 2020, 2030, and longer term targets after that are the only ways that we're going to reach our achievable goals. When we're looking at climate change, the first thing that everybody's thinking about is money. It's about the economics. So over time, climate change negotiations have really focused on environmental issues or energy choices, but when we get down to actually coming up with a global deal, it's really all about economics. And what does that mean for every country? Well, it means more than just turning off the lights when you go in and out. The World Bank has issued a report saying they think it'll be between $75 and $100 billion a year between now and 2030. There have been other reports that have estimated closer to $500 billion a year. The developing countries right now in the negotiations are looking for $200 billion a year. So an overall cost to deal with adaptation the numbers vary widely. The consequences for the U.S. in particular are being debated in Congress right now. So this is where we come to the question, will agriculture be included in where we should be reducing our carbon emissions from? Will it just be industry? Will we also include a section for the private citizen and what every person's carbon emissions are, and how will we look at that? Most likely it's going to focus on sort of big business, with a lot having been focused on power generation. There have been some discussions of carbon taxes. And we look around the world and sort of the impact that the U.S. legislation could have on countries that are export-driven, like China. This discussion of a border adjustment mechanism or a carbon tax comes up as a big piece of the pie for them. While the current legislation has a border adjustment mechanism that would not have a significant impact, according to the studies we've done, on Chinese exports to the U.S., just given the types of exports that we receive here, it's an issue for concern. And as you look at how do you spread the cost of climate change throughout the world, mechanisms like these are going to be ones that are creating increasing trade friction in our discussions. So what the U.S. does to try to make climate change not have a significant impact on our economy will be affecting all of the other economies, just the way that those economies' decisions will affect ours as well. And when you come down in the end to the global deal discussions, what all of the industrial countries are looking for is an assurance that China, India, Brazil, these other developing countries will not take advantage of us if we're able to commit to a carbon cap in the trade field. So to make sure that there continues to be a level trading field and that climate change does not become yet another trade mechanism that allows countries with a lower cost of labor to be able to sell more cheap goods to all of us. We're going to be dealing with climate change, regardless of where the global deal puts us. Estimates right now are that we will have at minimum 1 degree change in temperature over time, and we're hoping through these global negotiations to limit it to 2 degrees of an increased temperature over time. We're sure that we're going to be dealing with climate change as we go forward, and there are plenty of examples that are suggesting climate change is already underway, and as you know, those examples are often controversial. So, for example, the Indian environmental minister just issued a report this week suggesting that the melting of the glaciers in the Himalayas is not a result of climate change. They think that it might actually fit in with historic norms. Now, the IPCC has already said that they don't think that that's a very valid claim, but as you can see, the science is really easy to manipulate and difficult to predict as we go forward. So we're going to be dealing with climate change. There's no way not to deal with it, I think, is the underlying message to everybody. And the question is, can we limit its effects, and can we move fast enough to not have to deal with really dramatic changes in our environment? There's coming consensus throughout the international community that a full global deal will not be reached at Copenhagen. We're looking for different types of deals. Is it possible to put together a framework agreement? Or should we be focused on there being a political agreement on the top level issues? And those issues are that industrialized countries will commit to caps on their carbon emissions, that there will be a certain level of assistance given to developing countries. We're not sure yet if that deal is possible. Clearly, the negotiators are working very hard in Barcelona as well as other places around the world. Barcelona is right now where the last round of the formal negotiations are, but as you know, with any international negotiation, it's ongoing 24/7 throughout the world. So while we don't think there's going to be the perfect follow-on to Kyoto, we do think that there will need to be some agreement in order to keep the momentum for the international discussion on this topic. And it's the job right now for all of us who are either in governments or outside of governments is to make sure that Copenhagen is not seen as a failure, that this is really something, it's a difficult agreement to reach, it's complicated. I think about the Doha discussions and note that we did not reach agreement in Doha. And yet the climate change negotiations are much more complicated than Doha, involving more players than the Doha agreements were. So we have to put this in perspective. It's not a simple thing to do, but it is doable, and it's something that we're going to have to take one step at a time to get to. If we don't reach a deal in Copenhagen, the thought is that we will want to have a fairly rapid follow-on. So many people have suggested that we should try to come up with a framework agreement in Copenhagen, which includes an agreement to get back together in 6 months. Normally these types of meetings happen about once a year, or once every 2 years. The concern here is that if we let it go for a whole year, we're going to lose a lot of the momentum. The hope is that there will be U.S. legislation, probably January, February, hopefully not as late as March, in the U.S., which would then set things up to have a real discussion around a global deal sometime in the spring, sort of May, June, July timeframe. So the key will be for everyone to keep the momentum up, keep the energy moving forward, and at the same time, keep countries working together on some bilateral agreements. A bilateral agreement between the U.S. and China on how we're going to deal with carbon caps for China and for the U.S. might be very helpful in pulling together a global deal. At the same time, if it's not possible to have a global deal, we can be looking at bilateral agreements like that or multilateral regional agreements to help pull together different actors from around the globe, the important players, to start to deal with climate change in a concerted manner. So possibly something in 6 weeks, 6 months. Very likely we will be looking at some intermediate deals on a bilateral or regional basis before we come up with a final global deal.